Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with my army guide for the Ogre Kingdoms in Total War Warhammer 3, going over the various army compositions that you should use when you are playing your campaign. Early on, there isn't necessarily a lot of variety of units that you actually want to use in an Ogre campaign, like you have your Ogre Bulls with Iron Fists and Ogre Bulls with dual weapons. To be honest, out of these two units, I generally would always go for Ogre Bulls with dual weapons, because of that bonus versus infantry. So Ogres do a decent amount of armor-piercing weapon damage, they have a fairly solid charge bonus, they have Ogre Charge. The difference between dual weapons and Iron Fists and, regular Ogre Bulls are just not worth recruiting unless you literally have nothing else to recruit. But the difference is Iron Fists get a bit of extra armor, 10 extra armor and a bronze shield, but they lose that bonus versus infantry that Ogre Bulls with dual weapons have. And personally, I just don't think it's worth the trade-off, really, in a campaign situation, unless you want a bit more extra durability. But you know what gives you durability? Taking a lot of your Ogre boys and just charging head-on into the enemy and massing them in a big blob so that individual models of individual units take less damage. That's one way. Then we have Pigback Riders. The only real reason you may want to use Pigback Riders is for their anti-large benefit, but honestly, I think it's more of a meme unit than anything else. But yeah, Bronze Shield, low level of armor, but at least they don't affect the leadership of other units. Or of your Ogre boys. But really, the discussion in the early game with Ogres is about Lords and Heroes, because you have easy access to Heroes in an Ogre campaign, so that's really worth talking about. Hunters, always worth picking up for the sake of campaign movement range. Their combat capability while on foot is not that great, but once they get a mount, that discussion changes completely. They can buff some units, but really, the main reason you're getting Hunters is for that campaign movement range. Then we have Bruisers. So Bruisers are fairly solid in melee. They have that bronze shield, and you will get them from your regular Ogre Bull barracks. And so picking up Bruisers is a no-brainer, though you do need to own the Omens of Destruction DLC. So bronze shield, armor piercing, weapon damage, bonus versus infantry, and of course all the kind of bells and whistles that do come from using an Ogre hero, including Wall Breaker, which is always very, very useful to have. Then we have Butchers. Now, Butchers are your casualty replenishment heroes, but they also are fairly good from from a magical capability and a decent level of melee capability. The Lore of the Grey Maw is really what's worth talking about here, because you have a bunch of useful spells, including Troll Guts, which can heal you up, and you have passive skills as well that will give you Winds of Magic when you're engaged in melee. I'm not sure. There we go. Extra ingredients. So this gives you extra power recharge rate and reserves per second when you're engaged in melee. And yes, this does stack. This is one of the things that's ridiculous about Scrag, in particular with regards to Winds of Magic. Fire Bellies. So you get fire magic. Not as crazy good in a lot of ways as Butchers, but still worth getting at least one Fire Belly per army, getting things like the Flaming Sword of Ruin, for instance, as well as a couple of other spells. Always useful to pick that one up. Lord-wise, you have your Paymasters, who are actually the weakest of the Ogre Lords. You still have that Wall Breaker capability. Paymasters are more useful because they're cheap, and because of various skills that they have. It's always worth looking at the skills that Lords have, but to be honest, most of the reason you get Paymasters is if you just don't want to use a bunch of Tyrants or a bunch of Salon Masters and you just want variety. Speaking about Tyrants, your regular melee leaders, Wall Breaker, armor piercing weapon damage, decent level of armor, decent level of Melee capability, snacks, always something good to have. Then you have Slaughter Masters, again, Lore of the Grey Maw. So with Slaughter Masters, like with Butchers, you're looking at power recharge. If you're engaged in melee, you have those healing abilities, you have those AoE abilities. If you're looking at the Lore of the Grey Maw, but of course you can always diversify your lores of magic if you want so. But I think having a couple of Lore of Grey Maw casters, largely because of the skills, again, like, you know, you're looking at extra ingredients, as well as other skills that you do have with their skill line in the campaign, I generally find myself gravitating more towards Butchers of the Grey Maw and Slaughter Masters of the Grey Maw than anything else. At least when we're looking at Slaughter Masters, that's what I would generally go for. But yeah, those are kind of your early game choices. Yes, you have Noblars, regular Noblars, Trappers, Slingers, but I would generally not bother with those units in account. Towards the end of the early game, you will be looking at having tier 3 units available in your campaign, or tier 2 if you're talking about certain specific resource buildings with the exotic animals trait. And these units, the things you would be looking to recruit beyond, you know, having a bunch of heroes and improving your hero capacity with as many structures as you can, which is one of the main benefits of ogres, you do have Iron Guts, heavily armored, 100 armor. They do have Ogre Charge, they do have bonus versus infantry, a bit of bonus versus infantry, but most importantly, most of their damage is done with armor piercing. They're the natural upgrade path from Ogre Bulls with dual weapons. Though if you want something a bit crazier, you can always go for Gorgers. Now, Gorgers are not going to be as good from a charging perspective as regular ogres will be, but they do have a good amount of bonus versus infantry, armor piercing weapon damage, and most importantly, frenzy. So they get that melee attack benefit while their leadership is higher. They are unbreakable. They both Iron Guts, you know, a lot of units ogres have cause fear or terror. And the thing about Gorgers is while they do lack a lot of survivability, they more than make up for that in terms of their damage potential. They are quite scary to deal with in a battle. Like, the amount of damage these guys can dish out is actually quite high. And weirdly enough, I find that beyond just the stats themselves, that Gorgers tend to do substantially better than what their stats may suggest compared to, say, Iron Guts, in terms of the sheer damage capability they do have. Alternatives, you do have Yetis, but the main benefit of Yetis, yes, they have 40 armor, but really the main reason you would get Yetis is not for their armor-piercing weapon damage, but for their magical attack. So if you're dealing with enemies that have a good amount of physical resistance, you're looking at demons, or you want to slow down enemies, then that's the reason you bring Yetis. It's for that purpose in a battle. So it depends on the specific types of enemies you're dealing with. Then we talk a bit about artillery. So you can get Noblar scrap launchers as an artillery unit in a campaign. They do a decent amount of damage. They're basically your catapults, more or less single entity catapults. They can do, they're mostly useful from the perspective of being used in a siege to take down towers if you're struggling with that. Though many a times you may not necessarily care. They're also decent enough in melee like that, or their melee stats are not too terrible in theory. In practice, it's a bit of a different discussion, but still an artillery unit that has a decent amount of survivability, believe it or not. Then we have our lead belchers, and these guys, they shouldn't be viewed as an artillery unit because they're not really an artillery unit. They're basically ogre shotguns with 200 range, so they actually outrange most, quite a lot of proper range units. But yeah, for ogres, I'd consider these guys kind of like shotguns. Lots of armor-piercing missile damage. They still have Ogre Charge if you want to make use of that, but obviously their melee capability is not going to be great. They're mainly there to annihilate clumps of enemy forces before you engage with your guys in a battle. Though, You know, lead belchers are awesome, but you know what's even awesome? Well, what's even more awesome? Mournfang Cavalry. So, a tier 3 cav unit that, honestly, it's just ridiculous. So you have wall breaker capability, you have armor-piercing weapon damage, you have 68 charge, you have decent enough speed, 90 armor, and because there's fewer entities, they don't get quite stuck in as many other cavalry units will do. Sure, the fact that there's fewer entities per unit means that their stats aren't necessarily as you know, representative of their combat ability as you might think, because, you know, fewer entities kind of changes that dynamic around. But all the same, these guys are very scary cavalry, especially when you're looking at the tier that you can recruit them at. And to be honest, with ogres, tier requirements don't quite work in the same way that they do for other races, because ogres can abuse the hell out of meat. And you look at Maneater in particular, the amount of meat he can get from contracts. You can basically keep growing your settlements, keep growing your camps, and just get to like tier 4, tier 5 very, very quickly. And the only races that can really compete with that are like High Elves with Administrator or Karl Franz in a campaign. And that's one of the craziest things to consider about ogres. Because ogres especially can get access to some really scary monsters at tier 3 through exotic animals trade. So you can get Stonehorns, with harpoon launchers, and thunder tusks. And what these guys offer in terms of combat ability is quite crazy. You look at a regular Stonehorn, wall breaker capability, armor piercing weapon damage, bonus versus infantry, a heck of a good amount of health, not too terrible speed for such a big chunky boy, and 110 armor. Though, if you're recruiting Stonehorns, I think you're doing something wrong when the harpoon launcher variant is right there, and it's just the same unit, except it's mounting a freaking ranged weapon on itself, and that's the reason you want to pick up the Stonehorn with the harpoon launcher. So armor piercing, range damage, 250 range over there, firing while moving, and available at tier 3. And since ogres can get a lot of money pretty quickly in their campaigns, well, maybe a bit less with Scrag, but still, then yeah, harpoon launchers are the unit to go for. Or you can go with thunder tusks. You don't have quite the same melee capability, but you do have magical attacks, frostbite attacks. So, you know, if you're dealing with physical resistance, this is kind of the unit you want to pick up. Magical range attacks as well. Not as much damage as a harpoon launcher, but still a thunder tusk is still very useful, and you do get chilling aura, which reduces enemy speed. Generally a unit worth picking up. And again, these units can be recruited at tier 3 if you get exotic animals. Greases gets it, in Gore's starting settlement, though the climate there is annoying, it will slow you down, but still he can get it. Scrag has easy access to it, and Maneater just travels around the campaign map and does not give a damn. Then we have really kind of the endgame units of ogres that we should talk about, or some of the endgame units. First off, let's talk about Iron Blaster, a ridiculous artillery unit that fires 5 projectiles, does a ton of damage, and, you know, like scrap launchers, is not too terrible in surviving in melee if it really comes down to that, though. You obviously don't want to have that situation, but yeah, Grave Assembly with little Groms and with Ogre Artillery did make up some pretty durable single-entity artillery units. Though, obviously, from an artillery duel perspective, that's kind of the issue with ogres, but then you just close the gap and kill everything in pure melee. You do have Mournfang Cavalry with great weapons, so anti-large, armor-piercing weapon damage, wall-breaker capability. What's there not to like about Mournfang Cavalry? Or if you want a high-end cavalry unit that honestly might just be the very damn best in the game, you do have Crushers with great weapons. So what you get with these guys is just basically the same unit as Mournfang Cavalry, just better. 120 armor, good amount of speed, leadership, melee attack, not necessarily the best melee defense, but 80 charge bonus. This kind of unit, these guys will basically fly out win, I think, against pretty much any cavalry unit in the game, or very few of them will be able to win and, you know, make come down to skills that you do have for your lord, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, these guys are just pretty ridiculous. Also, keep in mind the army abilities that ogres have. One of the things that should not be ignored. You know, I kind of struggle with kind of units would defeat would defeat crushers with great weapons. I mean, a lot of cavalry units would struggle to defeat Morfang cavalry with great weapons, let alone crushers. It's just the tier requirement that makes them a bit iffy to use in a campaign, though. Ogres don't care so much about tier requirements because, again, you just need meat to upgrade your camp, so you don't have to wait for the population surplus points. We could have a discussion about the population surplus points themselves. Then we have man-eaters with great weapons. Surprisingly, ogres do lack anti-large with infantry until you start talking about these guys. So, yeah, these guys are your elite two-handed infantry, ogre charge, 54 charge bonus, 26 bonus versus large, most of the damage being armor-piercing. This is really one of the better units that the ogres do have in their army roster. Armor is not necessarily the best, but that's why we have man-eaters, as I call them. So these guys don't have anti-large, but they make up for it for a couple of things. So first off, they have adaptive tactics. So if they're losing in melee combat, they'll get melee defense, melee attack. They have armor-piercing weapon damage and bonus versus infantry. They're immune to psychology. And so, yeah, they're just a really solid unit with that dual-wielding capability. And they have more armor than regular man-eaters. If there's a unit you want to use to replace Iron Guts in your army, it's those man-eaters, the man-eaters with dual weapons. Another unit to talk about are man-eaters with ogre pistols. You know, it's kind of weird with man-eaters with ogre pistols, because they're actually quite annoying to recruit in a campaign, given the tier requirements. I mean, yes, as I said, ogres don't care about it as much, but what's weird is, like, you can get these guys from ogre mercenaries quite early on in a campaign, and while they're obviously not going to compare to regular man-eaters or the dual-wield version, the benefit of these guys is that pistol, armor-piercing weapon damage. They can also fire while moving. And that makes this unit quite rather effective. In fact, I would love to use them more in a campaign. It's just, again, that tier requirement. You might just say, well, these guys are just regular man-eaters with a pistol. But that does matter. Like, having that pistol, it's not really a pistol when it's doing 96 missile damage. Like, yeah, that's the thing to say about these guys. Because they can fire while moving, and ogres are really hard to corner down as units in a battle, then these guys can really harass the crap out of an enemy army, which is kind of something that ogres do lack with a lot of their other units, you know, that skirmishing capability. Well, this is as close to a skirmishing capability as you're going to get in an ogre campaign. We should also talk about the star of the show, the Eshin Man-Eater, a regiment renowned that is ridiculously good. In fact, I would dare say this is probably the single best regiment renowned in the game. I mean, yes, there are tanks, there are Illuminarchs, there's Red Saurians and all that stuff. But to be honest, very few or no regiments renowned can go up against a high-end lord or a lord and hold their own. The Eshin Man-Eater can do that and really be useful because he reduces the melee defense and armor of enemies, which is a very damn nice skill, as well as giving himself speed and melee defense. So yeah, you do get a good amount of combat capability from this guy. He gets Strider, Stock, Woodsman, Ogre Charge, Physical Resistance. He's quite scary. It's like Snitch in Ogre form. And honestly, if it came down to a fight between this guy and Snitch, unless Snitch has, you know, some really good items on him, I'd probably put my money on the Eshin Man-Eater. I mean, suffice to say, you may not win against Grimgor in a duel, but you can give him a run for his money, or at least keep him occupied, and that makes the Eshin Man-Eater really worth talking about. And I generally don't talk about regiments renowned because the logic of regiments renowned, yeah, they're always good to have, And there's different strategies. You can use them offensively, like keep them in your frontline armies, or keep them in reserve as a strategic reserve if one of your settlements gets attacked and you're not prepared for that. Anyway, that's all I had to say, and, well, they've killed Scarbrand in the time that I've talked about all of this. Costin signing out.